first channel of elimination is the lungs, respiration. And this is the place we start first, right? Because if you study the Vedic system of medicine, if you study the Chinese system of health and medicine, if you basically study any of the ancient systems, everything can be distilled down into us taking our first breath, right? When we're born into the earth, we're originally in a sterile environment when we're in our mother's womb. And then when we get incarnated into the outer atmosphere, we experience our first breath, right? That's actually when we experience our first moment of oxidation, is when we come into the earth, we come into the outer atmosphere, and we start to have to adjust to the oxidative stress in the environment, and we're no longer in a sterile environment, right? So breathing is actually the core of every single conversation when it comes to health, when it comes to detoxification, when it comes to the inner biology of our body and increasing oxygenation to the cells of our body. Because our cells run immediately on oxygen first. Before we produce energy from carbohydrates, from protein, from fats, from herbs and superfoods and supplements and any of that stuff, we first respire on oxygen. And organisms that are anaerobic in nature, meaning that they respire on fermentation, on sugar, these would be like parasites or pathogens. Those organisms invade our body when we are deoxygenated, when we have a lack of oxygen. If you look at cancer, for example, all cancerous formations, all cancerous growths in the body are the byproduct of the lack of oxygen running through the circulatory system, running through our blood system. And how do we increase this oxygen transportation? First and foremost is from proper breathing, right? Diaphragmatic breathing from the core, from the belly, not from the top of the lungs, like when we're in a city, for example. Like if you go to New York or you go to LA and you just observe people, just look with innocent perception and look at what people are doing. They're in shoes, they're in a rubber-soled shoe, so they're not grounded, and they're typically drinking whatever kind of water and eating whatever kind of food, so they're insulated from the sensitivity of their body, and they're breathing very tight. It's like that automatic cortisol fight or flight stress response, right? So what we're looking is to decrease that stress response by going to the core and breathing with our belly out. This is the yogic practice of breathing, is right? And there's many different ways of breathing and practices of breathing. That's not really what this is about, but understanding that the breath is primary for every other aspect of the health equation and for detoxification in particular. And the lungs are actually one of the main modes of elimination. You may have studied Chinese medicine or talked to a Chinese herbalist or Chinese practitioner, and one of the things they will talk to you about is actually observing what's going on with the tongue, right? If you stick out your tongue, the idea is that they can identify the ailment in the body or the digestive ailment based on the color of the tongue and the condition that the tongue is in, like candida or fungal growths, for example, or what they call a damp, wet spleen, which is too moist, too wet of a digestive environment. It'll usually show up on the tongue. So what I tell people is the first thing you do in the morning when your body is in a natural detoxification mode, meaning that it's eliminating all the metabolic byproducts from the night and nights before, you need to get one of the Ayurvedic tools, which is a tongue scraper. So in the morning, if you go out in front of your mirror and you look in front of the mirror and you stick out your tongue, you'll notice there's like a white film or a thrush on your tongue. And that's basically the metabolic off gas from basic metabolism from the food and the different functions of your metabolism from the night before. And that stuff comes up through the respiratory system, comes up through the esophagus, and coats our tongue when our mouth is closed as we're sleeping. So you want to scrape that stuff off your tongue to start your day. And there's an interesting aspect of this whole respiration piece. You know, as I've gone through the years of self-transformation and personal development and success philosophy, literature, and all the ideas around how to live the fullest life ever, I started to look out to other people and realize that most people are not doing that. They're not really living an inspired life. And I started to wonder, why is that? And I think it has a lot to do with this whole shallow breathing idea. Some of the biggest epidemics, physically speaking, is lung cancer. And I actually think that lung cancer is a manifestation of us not using our voice, us not speaking up for ourselves, us not speaking what we want into existence. So we keep our voice down, we keep it suppressed. And through the suppression of our spirit, it creates the manifestation of what we call some kind of lung respiratory inhibition, or the extreme manifestation of a lung cancer, where if we don't use it, eventually we're going to lose it. I think that's a really important principle just to inject into this whole conversation is the metaphysical piece. It's not just about the food, but speaking of food, what are the foods that are best for the lungs? One of them to look at is green foods. Green, chlorophyll-rich foods have an affinity to the respiratory system, to the lungs, to us actually increasing oxygenation to our red blood cells and getting all that beautiful green pigmentation in our green vegetable juice, in sprout juices like the old Anne Wigmore therapy from Hippocrates. They're very big on sprout juices. And once the sprouts kind of weave their way and get their little tentacles working through us, it starts to create more of illumination, more creativity, more imagination, more enthusiasm and inspiration in our life. And why is it that so many people are focused on retirement? Why are people trying to retire? Well, I think it's because they're not inspired, and it's probably because they're not respiring. If you're not inspiring, you're thinking of retiring, and it has a lot to do with not respiring, not having oxygenation flowing through your system, right? So green foods in particular have an affinity towards oxygenation and towards the lungs. And then moving on from there, Chlorella is a really powerful therapy because it's the #1 food in the world in chlorophyll. It's anywhere from 4 to 10% by weight in chlorophyll. That's the most in any food in the world. And then from there, I'd like to talk about things like cayenne, which is a vasodilator, increases blood flow. That's an interesting thing. Vitamin C rich foods like oranges, like lemons, all the citrus foods, camu berry, acerola cherry, rose hips, that kind of thing. But then from an herbal perspective, I just want to add in Maca Root has an affinity for lung function. It has affinity for increasing oxygen endurance in the body. Remember, maca is grown at the highest altitudes in the Andes Mountains. And in order for it to grow in such an environment that fluctuates in its weather so fast, it goes from 40 degrees up, 40 degrees down, rapidly, where no other crop can actually grow at that altitude, maca does. And so what that's indicative is that it actually increases oxygen. It increases respiratory endurance, and many of us have heard this, right? And then from there, the two primary herbs I would suggest for lung function are ashwagandha from the Vedic system and cordyceps mushroom from the Chinese system. If you incorporate those two things together, then you have a really powerful herbal adjunct to your detoxification pathways and also to your lung respiration system for respiration efficiency, right? Very important things to think about, and I'm sure that those two options will come up in later videos as we progress forward. There's two other foods that I like to mention in this whole respiration throat therapy conversation, which is raw organic honey and coconut oil. Raw organic honey, as most people probably figured out by now, is an incredible therapeutic agent for many functions in the body, specifically topically for healing scar tissue, for healing wounds, cuts, inflammation, things like that. But it's also really effective for alleviating soreness in the throat. And many people growing up, myself included, have done traditional therapies given by our grandparents, most likely, of hot water and honey, maybe with a little bit of lemon, right? And I've always found that to be a really effective thing whenever I had a sore throat or a cold or a cough or some kind of asthmatic thing going on. That was always a really powerful therapy, and it's kind of old folk wisdom. So I want to interject that into this conversation, and then also add in the healthy saturated fat that comes specifically from coconut oil. And many people would be interested to know that there's a coating around our throat called surfactant, and that's comprised 100% of saturated fat. And coconut oil tends to be the best fat for insulating the lining of our throat muscles, our bronchial muscles, and protecting it or insulating it from environmental toxicity. One of the things to remember is that we're breathing in toxins from our air. We're breathing in bromide from chemtrails. We're breathing in carbon monoxide from car exhaust. We're breathing in so much stuff from our environment that we have to insulate ourselves enough to offset or to protect our inner terrain from environmental toxicity. So I wanted to add in those two options for you to add into your lung respiration inspiration protocol.